Hi, welcome to the Bottle Talk and another episode in the Winemaker series. The yeast doctor, as I'm kind of calling him, Dr. David Bellows from Vidon Vineyards, which has since changed their name to Compris Vineyards, and we'll have that link for you. His convoluted but extremely cool journey of becoming a winemaker is none like I've ever heard. We discuss the benefits and challenges of growing grapes and making wine in Chehalem Mountains, branching out now into Tempranillo and Syrah, the three-part band analogy that he uses with the use of Pinot clones is definitely one that I'm going to steal and use in my own lectures. His belief in screwcap closures is very interesting and warranted, and one that I 100% am on board with. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. David Bellows. David, one of the first things I wanted to ask you or talk with you about was you had an interesting personal journey, which is a little bit different than a lot of other people who end up, going to school and coming out and making wine. It was convoluted, but I think probably ended up benefiting you in the long run.
I think so, yeah.
You want to touch that? I know you worked at Aurora in New York. Is that where it all
I
started,
did.
or did something happen before that got you interested?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So actually, I guess it really started a couple of years before that. I have a bachelor's degree that I don't even put on my CV anymore in San Diego, but I worked my way through college at what was then the Intercontinental Hotel. And the beverage I was in just worked in the bar, but the beverage manager had worked for Joe Baum in New York, and they had quite a good wine program, and that's really kind of where I started to learn about wine. And then we moved to New York. My then girlfriend, now wife, she was going to grad school at NYU, and so I said, "Oh yeah, New York, it's great." And fortunately, this beverage manager said, "Yeah, journalism is cute and all, but you're going to need a job when you get to New York City. So take these names." And I ended up working for Joe Baum, just starting in the bar. As everybody back then, there was really no kind of diplomas or anything. Everybody that had my job got it really in the same way. We all lied about how much experience we had. And I just started in the bar. And then as people kept leaving, I just kept saying, "Oh, I'll do that. Pay me a couple $1,000 more. And so after about 18 months, I was in control of everything that was liquid in the restaurant. And that was really kind of the way that everybody did it back then. And so the trick was, once you had, been conferred the mantle of New York wine guy, then, the world was your oyster, right? Then you start getting invitations to all the trade tastings and things. And so if you just kept your mouth shut for 6 months, or tried not to say something really stupid for 6 months, then you would have the experience that you had claimed to have in the first place. And so after, it was a kind of a trial by fire. So after about a year, it was a very intensive kind of boot camp of wine. But I ended up being the beverage director at this restaurant that was owned by Joe Baum, who is turns out to be quite a legendary restaurateur. He started Windows on the World and hired Kevin Fraley. He started the Four Seasons and some other restaurants that are legendary that are no longer around. But this was a restaurant that he owned on 49th and between Park and Madison. We left New York City, and I ended up in Arizona, and through a series of misadventures, I decided that it would be interesting to go back and become a winemaker. And so I went back to school and got a second bachelor's degree in biochemistry, thinking I was going to go to Davis and become a winemaker. And then I got distracted by the shiny toys in the laboratory. And again, through a series of misadventures, ended up with a PhD in molecular biology from a big medical school on the East Coast. I did the exact opposite of what I said I was going to do. But I mean, the serendipity, I think it really did. It helped. I mean, the critical thinking of, scientific training, being able to plan an experiment. And then for my postdoc, I chose yeast as my model organism. So for 20 years, I was a yeast biologist. And so that really, I think, informs a lot of what I do. Obviously my daily job now, I feel like I kind of know how yeast think. And then so I ended up through another crazy series, I was recruited down to New Zealand to open up to start a laboratory, a yeast laboratory. And I did that for a number of years. And then, the grant to grant lifestyle was just killing me slowly and then quickly. And we'd been expats, my wife and I, for a decade. And so in 2010, we finally decided, well, let's come back to North America. I was really tired of academia. I was really super burned out. And so I said, well, I'm just going to go and try to do the thing that I wanted to do 25 years ago. And that's be a winemaker. So we chose the Pacific Northwest because it reminded us, I was born on the West Coast, so I really liked this area. And it reminded us where we lived in New Zealand, and reminded us of Canada which is another place we lived, in a lot of respects. And so and also because the restaurant that I worked in New York, we were big on Burgundy. I lived next to one of the Pinot regions in New Zealand, so I'm a big Pinophile. So we chose the Willamette Valley, and I just came and started doing every job in the wine. I started working on the bottling line and worked in the tasting room and worked cellar, and then kind of just slowly worked my way up job by job, assistant winemaker, and here I am.
That's fantastic. Looking at that, I think if you sat down and ever wrote memoirs out and actually put a book together of that, it might be as interesting, if not more, than Kevin Disraeli's. I can tell you that.
his story is pretty interesting. I've met Kevin. He's a pretty interesting guy.
I just met him for the first time a month and a half ago, and got a chance to not only sit in on a tasting with him, but to chat with him a little bit afterwards. And he's a very interesting guy. I'll tell you. Well, great. That's awesome. So now here we are today.
Yeah.
You are in Chehalem Mountains.
We are in the Chehalem Mountains, yeah.
And you are working for a smaller boutique winery, Vidon Vineyards. And interestingly enough, one of the things I asked you, because I find it interesting, because winemakers have to have sort of an all-encompassing view of the process. I'm not sure if most people understand that they don't just take whatever comes in and go, okay, now I make the wine. They are involved in walking in the vineyards and looking at the grapes and making decisions and those things. So from all those places that you've been, and all the things that you've seen, what makes Chehalem Mountains special? And one of the things I remember asking you is, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages? Because every region, there's always give and take. What are some of those, and how does that work into your winemaking in Chehalem?
Yeah, so I guess I'd say that, one of the interesting things is kind of the defining characteristic of the Chehalem Mountains AVA is that it doesn't have a defining characteristic, right? That I think I wrote this in one of your answers. Just within our vineyard alone, some of the AVAs in Oregon have distinctive things that they're known for. The Red Hills of Dundee are almost entirely Jory volcanic soil. They're red because they've been rusting for 10 million years. Down in Eola Amity, you've got the Van Duzer Gap, and they're famous for having this incredible diurnal. You're wearing shorts at 4 p.m, and you're wearing a fleece at 5, right? Because of this wind that comes and goes and really makes an imprint on the wines. But the Chehalem Mountains, it's this. To use a Kiwi term, or a British term, it's kind of a dog's breakfast of geology, right? Within our vineyard, one of our blocks is planted on effectively 100% Jory soil. One is basically clay, and 2 other blocks are this crazy quilt in between, and they're only a 10-minute walk from each other. And so I think one of the advantages of our particular AVA is that it has this diversity of soils, and also it is mountainous aspects too. We've got hillside slopes, we've got a little bit of flat, we've got some that's in between, we have southeast facing, we have due north south, and so all of those things combined gives you kind of a big tool belt of things to work with when the grapes do come in. So the advantages, I think, we're in the far north end of the Willamette Valley, so we are still, I think, a cool climate region, though in the last couple of years you might not think that as much. And then of course, the disadvantages are like Burgundy. It's the exact same thing. We are a cool climate region. So I have certainly worked harvests where, we spent all summer in a glorious, fantastic ripening period where the winemakers go out and spend all the money that they were going to make, producing these fantastic wines, and then get 4 inches of rain on the first day of harvest. So that is the challenge in the Willamette Valley, is that depending on the varietals you have, it's still agriculture. It's, there's, and, in 2010, 2011, we worried about frost. Now we worry about other things, but there's always that Halloween rainstorm that comes and the race is on. Are you going to be all in before, the deluge? Yeah.
I remember you saying about the Halloween rainstorm, and I thought that was interesting. I thought, boy, if there's not a comparison there between Burgundy, where you have the guys sitting there with an ulcer waiting and looking at the ripeness of the grapes and looking at the weather forecast, going, oh man, did we give it another week or another couple of days? Or
we had that this year. Yeah, this year was like that. Even though the entire harvest was shifted forward, our rain, that comes was shifted forward too. And so even though I thought, oh, great, we're all going to be all in tank, still had the same, should we, I don't know, do we pick, do we wait, do we pick? That's that's what makes it winemaking.
I think you talking about having that cooler climate, it's just been my experience that I think some of the more interesting wines get made almost at the brink of where they can't be made, and having that diurnal temperature, which one of the things we talked about was maintaining good natural acidity, but also do you think there's a little bit more of a buffer with physiological and phenolic ripeness in your grapes in that type of climate?
Yeah, I think that in previous years, I would definitely say yes. I mean, that's the maybe 15 years ago, it was the opposite problem, right? You never you were never going to get enough sugar to actually get physiologically ripe. But now, I think the farther north you go, the closer you come to having them kind of cross the finish line together, right? I mean, the farther south you go, you're going to have these high Brixes, that before your tannins are ripe, or you reach some of those other physiological ripening benchmarks. And we have fortunately been able to kind of avoid that, because before the last 2 or 3 years, we've always had these kind of 50-degree nights, long sunny days where it was only got up to 80, and so the sugars kind of kept going up and up and up, but they didn't just shoot up to 30. We have had a couple of years in the last few years here where that does actually happen. So hopefully we'll revert to the mean, and we'll get more of those years where we get more, warm day, cool night, nice high acids at pick. But along with that, the kind of the soft clusters and mature seeds, and really, the nice kind of soft, mature tannins that, that we all appreciate with a great Burgundy or a Pinot from really any area. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chehalem Mountains being part of Willamette Valley, they've almost become infamous for their Pinot Noir and somewhat Chardonnay, but maybe more so Pinot Gris. Interesting, the thing that jumped out at me, and one of the interesting things that I really made me really want to try your wines, was the idea that you were growing some Tempranillo and some Syrah. And we'll talk a little bit later about the co-fermentation, but what made you look at the area and go, wow, this would be perfect for Tempranillo or Syrah?
Yeah, so those decisions were actually made before I came on. I don't know if you must have read the history of Vidon. So it's actually the original owner. The name is a portmanteau of Vicky and Don, the two people who started the vineyard. And Don was the one who actually made the original decisions to plant Syrah and Tempranillo. Um, and I can't necessarily speak for him, but I did work with him for a long time, and so I think I have some idea. And Don was he was always interested in. He was an experimental scientist as well. He was a particle physicist, or is a particle physicist. He's still alive. Um, Don was always interested in experimentation and seeing what was possible, and so I think the Tempranillo was really just an experiment to see what would ripen in the Willamette Valley. And you could there is Tempranillo that grows south of us in Oregon, in a much warmer region, Applegate Valley and the Rogue River Valley. But Tempranillo, it's in its name, I think, is the information that you need that maybe it'll grow in the Willamette Valley, and that is Tempranillo is a Spanish word that means a little early, right? Temprano is early, and Tempranillo is a little bit early, and it's one of the earliest ripening grapes in Spain. And so I think Don just thought, well, if it ripens early, maybe again we'll have enough heat days that we can get full ripeness before the rains come. So he put it in, and we call it Explorer Tempranillo because he had experiments on the Explorer satellites, but I think also it's really him exploring what will ripen in the Willamette Valley. We have a small block. It's less than an acre, so it's not a huge risk to plant Tempranillo. And then once it was in and we started making it, people love it. It's this very cool climate kind of Tempranillo. It's a very dark fruit, kind of lots of cherry, less of the kind of super plummy Tempranillo. It definitely has the varietal characteristics, but it's we've made it a couple times where the tannins are very kind of soft. It's very approachable. There are some Tempranillos down in the Rogue and Applegate valleys that are super grippy and really big. They kind of express that lots of heat. And so we make kind of an opposite style, and people really seem to like it. And then Syrah, people always think that the Willamette Valley is Burgundy, but the latitude of Burgundy is really up around Seattle, right? And Champagne's like up, Vancouver, British Columbia. And interestingly, Newburgh, where the Chehalem, the city where Chehalem Mountains AVA sits, is exactly the same latitude as Ampuis, which is where Hermitage and Côte-Rôtie are, the two great Syrahs in the world. I mean, I know the Australians would argue, Henschke maybe would say, what about us? But we're sitting right at the exact same latitude, so we get the same number of ripening hours. We have a little less heat than they do because they're continental. They're right in the middle of the country, and we're maritime. The Pacific Ocean's only 60 miles from us. So, we do have a little cooler and more challenging weather sometimes. But, I think it's no reason that great Syrah can't be grown here. And I think we're trying to, do our best to make it an interesting Syrah region. There are others that are growing Syrah too. So
I just found that very interesting. And just to touch on the Tempranillo, I definitely think it was varietally true. However, some Tempranillo can be, like you said, smack you over the head, not only grippy, but sometimes a little, out of balance with some of the alcohol levels that they get in some of those. Yours, I thought, was definitely cooler climate. And I found it especially with the sort of siltiness with those tannins, I thought it was a little more elegant than a lot of Tempranillos that you get. And I found it very refreshing. Yeah, I love that. And of course, Syrahs, there's some Australian Syrahs that are fantastic, but good Lord, there's got to be something to that whole Mistral thing. Because I'll tell you that those Northern Rhone Syrahs are fantastic, and I thought yours was more reminiscent of. Let me back up. I think that Pinot Noir in the northeast of our country, especially in a lot of areas of Oregon, is almost a little bit Burgundy and maybe a little bit New Zealand. It's sort of like you get little pieces of all those from that. I think that's one of the benefits of what makes it so interesting. And I could see some of the elements of what people would think of Syrah from even warmer climates in there, but it had this cooler elegance. I think a lot of those wines are either either a strip tease or a burlesque show. Some of those wines give you everything up front. It hits you and it got everything up front. And some you really have to take a second smell, a third smell, a second sip, because they slowly unveil themselves in that cooler climate. And I find those very refreshing that winemakers are making those. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, they're fun. They're great. I mean, I like the Syrah. I think we get that rotunda and that kind of black pepper note that really requires some cool weather to kind of maintain. We don't get that kind of the olive and bacon thing that they get in the Rhone Valley, but we're not the Rhone Valley, so
right.
We're our own thing. I mean, I do like that black pepper. We can get a little bit of the meatiness, but so far the last few years have been this kind of pure fruit and nice balanced tannins and that black pepper note that I really find super attractive. That's
the fruit is obviously ripe, but it's not jammy. It's not baked or jammy or dried like you get on some of those like some of the areas of Australia that are really warm. Some of the Syrahs, you're going, holy crap, they should have maybe they should have rethought this and made it into a fortified or something.
Yeah, our wine actually reminds me. So when we lived in New Zealand, we used to buy a wine that was kind of our daily drink. One of our daily drinkers called Mission Estate, and they had a Syrah that was made in Hawke's Bay, which is kind of in the north end of the North Island, but on the east side on the rain shadow. So they have a little bit warmer weather. I mean, you can't grow. They do grow Cabernet there, but I mean, that's a little bit iffy. But they grow these wonderful Syrahs up there, and we used to drink this Mission Estate and have that. It has the same kind of characteristics. It had that kind of darker fruit and that really nice black pepper. And so I've been trying to keep with that. To pick when it's when we're going to get those kind of flavor profiles.
Yeah. That's fantastic. One of the questions I had too, and in some of the other research that I was doing on you, I happened upon your comparisons of Pinot Noir clones, and I thought it was incredibly witty, and I'd love you to share that. The idea, and I'll remind you, I know you're doing clone 95, 115, 777, and Pommard, right?
Well, the 95 is Chardonnay, yeah. So we have 777, 115, Pommard, and 667 planted in the vineyard currently, yeah. And then we've got, for Chardonnay, we have 95 and 76.
Okay. When you were talking about some of the clones, you equated those or had those talked about a 3-part band. Yeah. And I thought I read that. And I thought, that is really quite witty. I thought so. If you could share that, I don't know if you remember exactly what you said, but
oh, sure, I can probably recapitulate it. So we make a wine called 3 clones. So we had the original kind of our heritage block, the first Pinots that were planted. Don planted 3 clones: 115, 777, and Pommard. And so for the last 20 years, we've been making a wine called, I mean, we're scientists, so we name things in the most obvious possible way. So our estate wine is called 3 clones, right? Because it's got 3 clones in it. That's interesting, I think, because we've been doing kind of this 20-year vintage variation experiment. It's made the exact same way. We're estate, so we don't buy grapes from anybody. It's made the same way every year. I've continued kind of a Don's winemaking style. It's the same dirt, it's the same grapes. The only difference from that wine year to year is just sunlight and rain, right? And so you taste a vertical of that wine and you can see the differences in the vintages because everything, it's a scientific experiment. Everything else is kind of held constant. And so we were making this wine that others would kind of call their estate, that we call the three clones, because it's equal parts each of the three different clones. And I have said that it's like the three clones is like a jazz trio. It's piano, bass, and drums all playing together, right? And that's why you make a cuvee, because you get different aspects from each of the clones that together makes this kind of synergy. And each of the clones has its own personality. They're named after Don's grandkids who had their own personalities, but each of the clones has its own personality. And so we make this three clones, which is like the jazz trio playing together, but we also bottle them by themselves. And so that's like, if you like a soloist, like the 10-minute drum solo, we've got that for you too. And so the 777, I think, is kind of it's our most aromatic clone, usually on every year. And that's kind of the piano, right? It provides the melody. It gives you the kind of all the aromatic notes that make up what we think of as wine flavor. And then 115 is traditionally our kind of most acidic clone. It also has this fantastic Bing cherry thing that if you like cherry kind of undertone Pinots, that one's your wine. But it provides kind of the acid backbone. So that's kind of the percussion, right? It gives you that, that's what you need, the acidity to give wine its vibrance, right? That's the foundation. For me, anyways, I really like acid-driven wines. And then the Pommard is traditionally the kind of the biggest, more tannin, more structure, and so it's kind of the shoulders of the wine. But that's the baseline, right? It provides kind of that kind of deep bass that you need too. And so when you put them all together, you get this wonderful kind of, not symphony because it's only a trio, but synergy of all three of them playing together. Though if you like a big structured wine, we also make Pommard for it.
I find that not only very interesting from a like Pinot geeky standpoint, but I find it also smart on a marketing standpoint that, everybody, I always tell people, just drink what you like and don't worry about what any wine experts or all the, I mean, just find a wine you like and drink the heck out of it. But, even inside of Pinot Noir, even in the same climate, there can be so much difference, as you said, between these clones that you sort of have shotgun approached that marketing on that Pinot. So that's smart that people would say, oh, this is my kind of Pinot. And someone, you sort of hit all the different bells there. So I think that's a smart marketing thing as well. I find that very neat, very neat. So we talked a little bit about how things are getting warmer and those types of things. I know you said you planted some Gamay. Is there anything else in the pipeline or any forward thinking that you're looking at, and how do you expect the Gamay to come out? How much of it did you plant as well?
Oh, so like a third of an acre. So we'll get a ton. It'll be 60 cases. Yeah. But a lot of our SKUs are like that. We make a Viognier every year because we the Syrah co-ferment, right? We have 10 rows of Viognier, and we've got about an acre, a little less than an acre of Syrah. And so we kind of pick enough Viognier with the Syrah to make the kind of that co-roti style co-ferment. And then whatever's left over, we just make a traditional Viognier. And so each year it's like 28 cases. It's like a 30-gallon. This year's about 70 gallons, so I probably have. Yeah, I have about 20. I have about 30 cases. But our customers really like it. It's released in summer and it sells out right away. The Gamay, we're gonna do the same thing. We have just enough to make a couple barrels probably. We're still having discussions about. I really love the Cru Beaujolais, so I'm gonna want to go for that.
I'm with you. I'm gonna interrupt you. I think you're hitting. When you said acidophile and stuff, I'm going yes.
Yeah.
But when you said Cru Beaujolais, I think is probably one of the best bang for your bucks in all of France. I don't know why people aren't drinking more of it, but
yeah, for my birthday this year, I had this fantastic Saint Amour that, it was, it was so good.
Yeah,
Um,
and they're incredibly food friendly as well. I think
and
Gamay.
that's the thing, right? That I was a couple years ago. We lived in Sun Valley Idaho for a while, and I was a beverage director at a resort hotel, and so I had a friend who owned a distributorship. I saw him a couple years ago, and he said, I don't know why there isn't more Gamay planted there. He's like, it's the perfect, it's the perfect food wine. And our president Taquette, she says, that Gamay is kind of it's like the love child of Syrah and Pinot, right? It's kind of that halfway in between those two. You get some spicy notes, but it's also got that kind of lovely silky quality to it. We are taking out a little bit of Chardonnay, and we're still at the early stages. I also have totally fallen in love with those kind of Loire Valley reds, the Cabernet Franc, the Bourgogne.
Bourgogne, Saint Nicholas, the Bourgogne. Oh yeah, oh yeah.
So if it is continuing to get a little warmer, we might do another experiment with some Cabernet Franc. I don't know.
That'd be interesting.
Stay tuned.
I think Gamay unfortunately is still getting, it has a bad reputation for two reasons. There's no one around that still remembers William the Bold, but obviously it being ousted out of Burgundy at one point, and then I think everyone looks at Gamay as the Beaujolais Nouveau that comes out every year, and that's fine. You chill the heck out of it, do whatever, drink the heck out of it, but I think that a few tastings that I've done, I've slipped those in blind, and people go, "Wow, what is this?" I go, "Oh, that's Gamay," and they go, "Doesn't taste anything like that George DeBoeuf Beaujolais Nouveau. I don't understand."
Right? There's no bubble gum. Yeah.
Now that you touched back, we can go back to some of the Pinot Noirs, because I find it not only clone wise, but looking now at the winemaking of Pinot Noir, there's so many variables, and obviously things that can come and cut your tail as a winemaker. There's some decisions that they make, whether whole cluster versus whole berry, partial stem inclusion, all those kind of things. One of the things you said is you destem everything, whole berry.
We do.
So from a winemaking standpoint, what are the benefits and drawbacks of whole berry versus not, whole cluster, or stem inclusion versus not? Let's say that.
Yeah. So, there are a couple of things. One of them is historically is that we're very small. For a while, for many years, either Dawn or I was the entire production department, right? And so some decisions are made just because you have to be able to get everything done. A lot of the whole cluster here has been because in years past, it's been so hard to get physiological ripeness, before 2012 or so. You could benefit from having those extra phenolics from the stems, especially if you were able to get, some lignification right at the end there. You could throw the whole thing in and get some extra body and phenolics from the stems that were going to be a little lacking. And then in the last few years, we've had such warm weather that, I think a lot of people are now getting fully physiologically ripe berries. We actually sit on a particularly warm site. We are known for being a very warm site, kind of due south facing, a hillside slope, very rocky, especially in the Jory, it's just kind of bare earth. It kind of holds the heat. Our Tempranillo block is super rocky. It kind of holds all the warmth. And so historically, we have found that we just don't need a lot of extra phenolics, that the grapes that come in provide a really nice body, and you don't want to go too far. I like, it's the three-legged stool, right? You want the balance between the acidity and the phenolics. And so we have found that, at the end of this season, bringing them in, that we tend to have plenty of the phenolics and body. So we just haven't done whole cluster. I've worked at other places where we do whole cluster. I think it's a perfectly fine way to do it. when you're the only one there, if you have a tank, if you have a tank that's 100% whole cluster, they're very difficult to work with. It's, cap management is a whole different experience because the entire thing is cap, right? I mean, it's now you got to get in the tank and do a pigeage to break everything up. And if you got 15 tanks and it's just maybe it can be easier to work with whole berries. But if you also have beautiful ripe whole berries, it's all one thing. So, I think if we had another season like 2011 where it was a long, cool kind of harvest and we were struggling to get things ripe, I would certainly think maybe 25-30% whole cluster in the bottom of the tank, to start. Sure. So I'm not averse to it, but historically we haven't really needed it. And it's, the way all the machinery is set up and the way our fermenters are set up, it's just been not easier, but it's been a more straightforward thing just to go through and destem everything and then treat everything the same, right? That's where we were so small. We're not like a big place that's got 100 acres and they got different blocks and they can say, oh, we're going to do this one's going to be 25% whole cluster and this is going to be this. And, I've only got 10 fermenters. And so to have everything go through the same way, considering that we only have a little 5-acre plot for the Pinot anyways, let the as someone said, got a great site, just let it speak, so that's kind of what we do.
I'm glad that you mentioned some of the things in there that you did, because I think that the layperson, the consumer, a lot of times doesn't understand that, well, why didn't they just do it this way? Well, there's a lot of other logistics involved, and it's not just a limitless amount of tank space and a limitless amount of help and a limit. Yeah. So some of the things that you touched on there, I think are eye-opening to some people who don't think about those elements. So absolutely. Okay. But now for your Pinot Noirs, they come in, you make the wine,
Yep.
French oak only, right? For your Pinots?
That is correct. Yep.
What
we are tradition? We used to say, we're not constrained by tradition, but we are traditionalists with that. Yeah.
What type of French oak and how long do your Pinots spend in there? Do they vary between your Pinot Noirs or?
Yeah. So the house kind of Cooper historically has been Cadu. I like oak to be just an accent and not the first thing that you see, right? And so the nice thing about the Cadu barrels is they're not super, ours in the kind of medium toast 3-year air dryer, not super aggressive. They just give that kind of little vanilla and cinnamon hints, and they really seem to complement the wines that we make. And then in the past few years, another winemaker turned me on to some barrels. So I've been experimenting with Mercury, and they've got a couple barrels. They've got a special toast that in the past seems to have provided kind of an extra note that is very attractive. So each year we make a barrel select wine where, in doing the barrel tasting to decide what's going to become the 3 clones and then what's going to be the single clones, you taste every barrel in the barrel room. And there's always a couple barrels in that tasting where you go, oh man, it tastes so good. If we mix this with anything, we're just going to lose it, right? And so we set those kind of 2 or 3 barrels aside, and this will lead up to barrel age. And those guys become our barrel select. And since I started this kind of, experiment with Mercury, it seems like every year, one of the Mercury barrels is the barrel select. And so, we haven't necessarily like converted over. It's still kind of a kind of 2 to 1 really, Cadu to Mercury. But I think it makes a nice balance. And again, we're so small, right? I mean, 30 barrels is kind of the entire barrel room. And so if you start playing around and say, oh, this year we're going to buy Ternceau, and this year we're going to buy, Raymond, and this, then there's, you have this extra variable that's just very difficult to keep a handle on. We're just not big enough to start playing around and say, oh, well, let's buy 10% of this and see what it does. I've only got, we're going to put 6 barrels or maybe even 3 barrels into the single clone, right? So maybe it's going to be 2 of the Cadu and 1 of the Mercury, something like that. And so if you start playing around, it gets very complicated with, doing keeping track of which barrels are your kind of favorite. So we should just kind of pick a lane and stay with it. So for the 3 clones, that is the wine that is not over vintage, is kind of our lighter wine that's made to be consumed earlier. And so that one gets bottled before the next harvest. And then the single clones and the barrel select get another 6 months of barrel age. And so, they get more, of course, you're evaporating water out. And so they concentrate over those 6 months. It gets 6 more months in barrels. So they get more of the kind of the barrel phenolic. So the single clones are kind of deeper and more concentrated. And so what we try to do each year is try to make a series of wines that you can drink over 10 or 15 years, hopefully 15, 20, who knows. So that the single clones are kind of released. I mean, the 3 clones are kind of released 2 or 3 years after the harvest. And then they kind of, go up and reach cruising altitude over the next few years. And hopefully that's drinking really nicely out to 6 or 7 years. And then, slowly starts to tail off. And at that point, the single clones are kind of now reaching cruising altitude and will be in their kind of prime drinking, level for the next 2 or 3 or 5 years. And so, you have this kind of portfolio where you have wines that are hopefully, drinking at their peak for quite a long time after each of the harvests. That's the idea.
That makes perfect sense, and I think you did a good job of explaining that as well. That makes perfect sense. Now, if we leave the Pinot Noir and go into sort of what captivated me was that Tempranillo and Syrah. So the challenges of making good wine from these, because sometimes they're a little tricky in making those, and the challenges of using co-fermentation with your Viognier. And if you could touch on what you think Viognier adds to that wine. And does it change the way that you approach making that wine? In other words, if you had a Syrah that you were making that wasn't co-fermented with Viognier, how would you make that differently, or would you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the challenge of doing the co-ferment is you require both of them to ripen at the same time, right? So this is the trick. And normally they do. I mean, normally they're pretty close. This year we did have a problem where we had to let the Syrah hang. It's usually the last one that gets picked anyways. But with all the heat, the Viognier was kind of ripe early. So then, what do you do? So we picked part of the Viognier and just made the white wine. And then we left a couple rows. We kind of did the calculation and decided if we have 2 rows, that'll probably be enough for the Syrah. So we'll just pick all that together. And that seemed to work this year. So that is the trick with the co-ferment, is that you either have to do something like, pick the white grapes and keep them in a refrigerator I've never tried that, but that would be one thing that you could do, is separate them, keep them for a while until the reds came in. This year we just went ahead and, let some hang and pick them, and it seemed to work. I like the co-ferment. It's really interesting. I'd never made Syrah before, so the first year here at Vidon, it was kind of a big surprise. The co-ferment is interesting in a couple aspects. Of course, Viognier is this very aromatic grape. It's known for, that's kind of its thing. It's known for having these floral notes as a white wine. And those, I think, translate into some of the aromas in the red wine. And that's especially evident, I think, during fermentation. And I remember the first year that we made that wine, or that I made that wine, thought I would make it. after the cold soak, the ferment starts, and then there's this first or second day where you get these fantastic aromas. If you've ever been, there's nothing like a winery in the middle of ferment. When you walk in, the smells are just incredible. But I remember that the Syrah tank, it started off and it smells like, it had this very floral kind of note. That's really weird for this red wine. And it went on like that for a day or two. And then from there on, it smelled like, Hickory Farm smoked meat. It got this very, meaty, Syrah thing going. And so I think those floral notes translate into some kind of, high notes in the aromas. Of course, Viognier, part of the reason to do it is because the phenolics in there, they're plainer, and so the phenolics in the Viognier will kind of stack with the anthocyanins in the Syrah, and they use it to fix the color. I think also, you can also think, Viognier is a much more acidic grape than Syrah. Syrah is known for being this kind of high pH grape, and color is pH dependent. The higher the pH gets, the more towards blue that you get. You can turn a glass of wine blue by adding a little soap or sodium hydroxide if you happen to be a scientist. And then the more acidic it gets, the redder it gets. And so adding white grapes would also be a way in the olden day, the old school days, to kind of change the color and profile of your wine and the acidity of your wine just by adding a grape that's a little more acidic. Now, of course, we have a bag of tartaric that I could just toss in, but it's a lot more fun to play around with these the kind of the white red ratio, and we've done that too. I mean, the first year I made it, we did 5% Viognier, and you can in Cork, you can use up to 20%. So you have a big, range to play with. We've always been kind of conservative. In 16, Don used he'd knocked it down to 3%. I thought those were perfectly nice wines. I thought that was a beautiful wine. We just sold out of that. But in 17, when I came back, we went back up to 5%, and that's kind of where I've been ever since then. I really like that little extra Viognier.
Do you, touching on that, it's interesting because I don't really know the history, but I'm wondering now in a place like Northern Rhone, where ripeness, especially 50, 75, who knows how long ago, would have been difficult at times, and you leave those grapes on to try to get ripeness, and as your acidity level plunges, I wonder if originally, you saying that, I never thought of it, it was that original way to try to balance the wine back by adding some Viognier, and
yeah, I mean, if you look at it, Cork is as far north as you can get in the in the Rhone Valley. It's the last stop. It's like the end of the Willamette, right? And then below it is Hermitage, which is, I mean, of course, they're only a couple miles apart, but that's 100% Syrah. Yeah, and your question about would I treat it differently? Yeah, I don't know. I think I'd still pick at the same time. It would just have a little different flavor. I don't know. Again, we only have a couple tons. I've only got one or two fermenters, so you just.
That's interesting though. That is interesting. So one of the things we have not talked about yet, and your area of expertise, is yeast. Now, I think you know a little bit about that. Obviously, you've spent decades working with it. One of the things that you touched on when we were exchanging information back and forth was that you use all indigenous yeast. With all that seems to be a sort of motif that a lot of winemakers are going back to, that especially in a time when making yeast that have all these different characteristics seems to be a very lucrative business for people who are growing all these different yeasts. So what characteristics of indigenous yeast did you feel that was important to keep that, as opposed to going out and getting some cultured yeast that that do a number of different, or claim to do a number of different things to your ferment?
Well, they do. They do. I mean, they do different things to ferment. Um, I don't know. I think again, this was a decision that Dawn had made in the beginning, and the other wineries that I've worked at. I mean, I worked at a winery called Aloro under a Davis trained winemaker, Tom Fitzpatrick, for a couple of years, and so almost everywhere I've worked has done natural ferments. It is kind of the thing up here. There are, I'm trying to think. I would say the number of people who inoculate may be fewer than the number of people doing wild ferments up here. It's just kind of that, it's one of the, it's in the valley's DNA, I guess. We, again, Don, he always says he's lucky. I mean, and I think in this respect, he did get lucky in that, it's a big competition, right? So in the first few years, you're just pulling in some random yeast out of the environment and just letting them go. And that's always I mean, I think this is the people's fear. It's a crapshoot. Are you gonna be able to get them all through ferment? Are they gonna stick? Are they gonna have, is it gonna be are there gonna be multiple different varieties of yeast in there? They're gonna give you some really funky aromas and things. And I think in the early going, he had a couple of those problems. But then what happens, and this is what the champagne houses have found, is that after a few harvests, it's a competition in the tank. And at one point, there's a yeast that has won, right? And you end up with this kind of house yeast. And each champagne house has their own like house yeast, right? That they've managed to get in the extreme conditions that champagne grows. Each of them has selected for this like super yeast. And so I think, each place that does it here ends up with the same thing. And Don got lucky in that we ended up with this very kind of robust yeast. And I'm sure, if you look in the vineyard, it's very hard to find yeast. But if you took a swab in the winery and swabbed the wall and struck it out on a plate, like 50,000 colonies of yeast would grow. I mean, the entire production facility is just inoculated with yeast. And so I think once the ferment gets going, that kind of strong house yeast takes over and wins. And in fact, I don't, except for our new sparkling program this year, I don't even inoculate white wines, which others tend to do because it's a danger, right? White wine is very acidic and it's a very harsh environment, Chardonnay. And so we traditionally have indigenous ferments that go all the way through with our white wines too. So again, I say, Don either got lucky or, selected for a particularly robust yeast. So in that respect, it's great. We have yeast that seem to kind of chug through even the worst conditions. Of course, when you do this, yes, we have had wines that have stuck before, and you do have to address that. But most years, just let them go. And it's part of everyone talks about terroir, but it is part of the terroir, right? They came from this place, and every year they're there to kind of do the job. So that becomes kind of the house style. I like seeing them take off. It's always amazing every year that you do that 5-day cold soak, and then that 6th day you warm them up to 70 degrees, and you come in the next morning, and it's the whole thing is just going, right? And it's amazing every year. It's a fantastic thing. Yeah.
One question also I saw, and I have read that different people handle this differently, but your indigenous lactic acid,
LAB, yeah.
LAB, for mallow, obviously, on a white basis, partial mallards. You take it case by case. All reds for stability purposes and stuff. You're going to go through that. Do you allow your fermentation to finish and then your mallow starts, or does it start occurring before? Because I've heard that some inoculate before the end of fermentation. Help me understand that a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just reading about that the other day. So we actually are indigenous malolactic too. We just let them go. With very rare instances, they finish mallow. I mean, I've got one tank right now that's a white that needs, that I'll have to inoculate a commercial lactic acid bacteria just because it's not gonna go. So I actually don't know the answer to that question because we use natural malolactic as well. Each year it's a little different. I was looking back over my notebooks, and like in 2017, I don't think I sulfured. You don't add sulfur until malolactic has finished because those bacteria are very sensitive to sulfur, and so I think I didn't sulfur until like March of 2018 because it just took all winter to go through mallow. And then this year, I think mallow was like mostly done before Thanksgiving. So, in fact, I was talking with my mentor Tom, and he said he thought this year that mallow was, went with fermentation this year. That they started almost simultaneously. And yeah, so there are different approaches. Some people have co-inoculated the yeast and the malolactic and the lactic acid bacteria at the same time. And there are a number of different thoughts on this about whether it should be sequential or simultaneous. That do you get additional flavors and things if you wait and have them go one after the other. If you talk about Brettanomyces, you might want to have them go together because the faster you can get it done, the faster you can get sulfur down and protected. So I don't know. I think it's every winemaker is different in that respect. I mean, I know there are some people who would certainly be leery of letting the natural mallow do their job. We seem to have a good result year after year. I'm going to stick with it, I think. Interestingly, so there was the Henny Van Buren at UBC actually developed a yeast where they cloned in the what is it, the malate transporter, because yeast normally can't take up malic acid, so they cloned in a malate transporter so the yeast could actually take in malic acid, and then they cloned in the bacterial I can't remember the name of the enzyme, the one that converts malic to lactic into the yeast genome so that the yeast could actually ferment both simultaneously.
That's very interesting. I'm definitely going to have to, now that you mentioned that, I am going to look that up and I'm going to read that article. That is very interesting. Huh. Wow, I have not heard about that. That is something that, good. You give me some homework. That's good. Another thing that I wanted to touch on that I thought was very interesting and unique was your philosophy on not using corks for the closure, and actually even having a development of the special argon bottling that you do. And I'd love to stop by because I'm intrigued about the fact that you have a by the glass that uses argon on site. Is that correct?
Yes. So we have changed the way the tasting room works now with the pandemic and everything. So we do not use the argon system that we used to for actually pouring the glasses, and that's just because of the way things have worked out. But you are right, we do sparge with argon in the bottles to try to minimize the amount of oxygen uptake during bottling. And yes, we are cork free in the winery. Cork is, I mean, I guess every disappointment I've had in the last 30 years with a bottle of wine has been because of cork, right? And that's whether it, was taint, or whether the cork failed, or, I mean, I guess the problem is, cork is a living thing. No two of them are the same. And so I used to say, if you put a case of wine under cork and you let it sit for 10 years, and then you open that case, open all those bottles at the same time, it's like 12 different wineries made your wine, right? They're all different. I mean, one of them probably has, well, there's a chance one of them is tainted, or was. They've made a lot of kind of progress in that area in the last 10 or 15 years. One of them, you're not going to be able to extract the cork because it's disintegrated. One of them is going to be over-oxidized. So, as a scientist, what you would like is consistency. And so, having lived now in New Zealand, where the entire country has switched to screw caps, Australia too. I think part of the problem, Australia found this, is that, they weren't getting the best corks from Portugal. And so they were having big problems, and they're a long way away. And so they have switched to, Stelvin screw caps that allow you to kind of have control over the oxygen transfer that goes into the bottle. Of course, in the early days, that was a problem in that they were hermetically sealed, and you had the opposite of the problem with cork, which is oxidation. You had reduction. But now I think they've solved that with the kind of the foil that they put in the top. Now they have different ones that allow different amounts of oxygen in, and so you can really kind of fine tune the amount of kind of bottle age that you get. And then we also use these glass stoppers called Vinylocs, which are really nice. They're like the aluminum Stelvins. They're recyclable. They're a piece of glass. You can throw it into glass recycling. And then they have a little polypropylene or some I can't remember what the actual chemical is, but it's it's a collar that seats the glass stopper on top of the neck of the bottle, and that collar allows oxygen through. It has its own oxygen transfer rate, but every single bottle has the same amount, so you get the consistency of, not the variability of a different cork having a different aging potential. And so we like those because they allow consistency.
Yeah, that's interesting. You just answered that question, because I knew with Stelvin that initially the screw caps were having reductive issues because they were trying to get get oxygen crazy, and get all the oxygen out as much as they could. And I knew with the Stelvin that they had the capability of having variable oxygen ingresses based on what type of closure and stuff you had, what type of cap you put in. I was unaware, because I was going to ask you about your total package oxygen, and did you have reductive issues since you sealed it? You taught me something, because I did not know that the gasket that was sort of fitted on there, that also had that type of capability as well. I was unaware of that. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a little polymer, and in fact, because I worked in New Zealand, I was part of the yeast, the Australasian yeast group in down there. One of my colleagues was Paul Henschke, who is a scion of the Henschke winery, and his brother Stephen runs Henschke, which has one of the most, aside from Penfolds Grange Hermitage, is one of the most famous Syrahs in the world, which is their Hill of Grace, right? And so years ago, Stephen switched his Hill of Grace to the Vinyloc top. So if it's good enough for Stephen Henschke, it's good enough for me, because he and his brother have done quite a bit of research. And I think Paul told me once that Stephen said he thought that his standard 750 ml bottle under Vinyllock aged at about the same kind of rate as his magnums under cork. I would have to, I have to call Paul and confirm that. But I seem to remember him saying that it was kind of a slower, gave you a longer kind of aging runway with the Vinylocks. But they did have this kind of linear, slow micro ox uptake. We really like them. I love them. They don't. The failure rate is extremely low. Every once in a while, one won't seat and you'll get some leakage, but it's like, so few bottles ever get returned. It's like one in 5,000 maybe. I don't know. We never see it in the winery that there are, capsule failures. So they're fantastic. And then that polypropylene or whatever the polymer that they use, we actually use that in the winery as well. The Australians have found that if you have like these polypropylene tanks, that they breathe a little, right? That it's not like a stainless steel tank. Like you put a white wine in a stainless steel, right? It's hermetically sealed, and you get that super bright fruit. And so we have some polypropylene tanks in addition to the oak that we use for all of our wines. And what we find is that they act like a neutral barrel, that they don't, they kind of shaves off those rough edges that you get with stainless steel because you get this oxygen that can transfer across.
Okay, so you're getting a little bit of like a pseudo micro oxygenation with that.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Okay. One question about that. I don't like to ask a lot of numbers questions because that's but without getting too specific, cost of cork versus cost of those glass stoppers.
It's about the same. It's
okay.
Yeah. I mean, a good cork is like $1. I mean, really good corks are expensive. The Vinylocks, they're like, what are they, 65 cents, something like that. So it's about the same price as a decent cork.
Okay. That definitely makes economic sense then,
Well, so I think one of the reasons that people have had for not switching over is that in terms, especially if you're big and you're bottling a lot of cases, is that until very recently, there wasn't a way to automate putting the little glass stopper in the bottle. And so bottling trucks don't have the capability of doing Vinylocks. And so people are hesitant to shift over because we built our own bottling line, right? I mean, we have our own little 60 PSI pneumatic ram that puts them on, and everything is done by hand at the dawn. And so, it's easier as a small operator to do Vinylocks if you're not doing like 10,000 cases and you need a truck, because now you have a whole new, there's just no one up here that can help you out. You need your own bottle. So
that was one of the arguments initially of going from those people with the bottling lines going from cork to screw cap.
No, exactly. Yeah.
That cost of converting over, especially if you're a huge winery, you go, man, that's a ginormous cost to start over. So absolutely. Well, that's
and the same. I think the same thing applied in the very beginning. You had to have someone who stood there and put the screw caps on. That's the I've stood there on a bottling truck and done that. Yeah.
That's why they ask for interns.
Exactly.
One of the things, one of the questions that I find very interesting when I talk with different winemakers is, so this is a standard question that I ask a lot of them, and I really like the way that you answered this. It was, what wine that you make gives you the biggest challenge and why? And which ones do you think expresses your ability as a winemaker and why?
Yeah, well, I mean, every year there's a different problem child. So, each year I don't know which one is going to be the biggest problem. It's going to depend on like this year, probably Syrah, because again, the rain came in and was like, oh, are we gonna pick, or are we gonna let it hang? That one was the one that gave me more gray this year. But I think in terms of actual winemaking, it's probably our Chardonnay. It's the trickiest, I think, to get it right. And because it's a white wine, there's kind of nowhere to hide, right? I mean, with the big red wine, you can do things that, there are lots of places to hide things. With the white wine, it's right there. And so that's the wine each year that I probably spend the most time, thinking about and working on. And the way we actually make it is probably the most complicated thing that we do. With the Pinots, I mean, I hate to say it, but most of it is made out on a great year, it's all made out in the field, right? I mean, on the perfect year, you bring it in, you destem it, and since we don't even inoculate anything, you keep it cool for a couple of days, you let it warm up, and then 3 weeks later you press it, and then you're done. I mean, that's the ideal Pinot. Is I don't do anything. I don't add acid. I don't, have to add sugar. I don't have to do anything. There are, years where it's like, yeah, we I didn't really do anything. I just kind of watched it do its thing. Whereas the Chardonnay, we have kind of worked over time to get a Chardonnay that we get a lot of comments on. People say, normally I don't like Chardonnay, but I really like this Chardonnay. That we get that like every day. And I think part of that is because we've worked on arriving at a place where it's got a nice balance. And to do that, it takes quite a bit of work. I mean, our press program is very complicated. And I kind of do this, I'll go into the weeds again. I kind of do it's kind of a modified or partial black style, right? So, I mean, you're aware of this, that there's two different ways to kind of make white wine. You can do it reductive, where you don't let any oxygen get to it at all. And the beauty of that is that it retains kind of all the wonderful flavors and aromas, right? But it can be very unstable, and browning can be a problem, and oxidation, things like that. And then there's the opposite one, which is you can really give it a bunch of oxygen in the beginning and let the phenol oxidases do their work. And what happens is it looks terrible. It's brown, but those things all polymerize and they all precipitate out, and then you get this clear wine. And that's very stable and kind of silky. And so, but the problem is you can lose some of because of all the oxidation and, aromatics, these esters and things are quite volatile and unstable. You can lose some of the wonderful kind of aromatics. And so we do both. So in the low pressure pressing, I give it a lot of sulfur in the pan, and I really knock down the phenol oxidases. And so I keep that one, because there aren't, this is where you're pressing just kind of the pulp. And so there aren't very many phenolics in that fraction, but that's where all your wonderful flavors and aromas are. And so we put that into a tank with a lot of sulfur, and keep the oxygen away. And then as the pressing gets higher and higher, like above 1.2, I know you want numbers, but as we get where we're pressing kind of hard, then I switch over to another tank for that fraction, and I just run oxygen through that for hours and hours and hours, because that's where all of the phenolics are. But that's kind of also where that wonderful mouthfeel is. And so what we do is we make that little sub tank, it's probably 10%, a black wine. And then after all of that oxidation has taken place, I pump that back into the original wine. And now with all the sulfur, it cuts off all the phenol oxidase reaction. And those phenolics will now precipitate out, but you also retain some of those kind of aromatics and things. And so that's why I say Chardonnay is kind of the most winemaking that we do, because you really have to decide what you're gonna, how you're gonna end up with the final product. Whereas
that's a very interesting approach. So you're trying to get the best of both fractions,
yeah, yeah,
that's very interesting.
yeah.
And
I've heard, I mean, that's kind of what we've landed on. That's
I've heard other winemakers, and I've read that they call Chardonnay a winemaker's grape, and they say it's a tabula rasa, it's a blank slate. What you do with it when it comes in. And I think I've countless times had people say, I like white wines, but I don't like Chardonnay. And I said, well,
all the time.
Yeah, it depends. If you're going to get a Chablis, or you're going to get, there's so many ranges, so many different ways to have Chardonnay. But I think that there's just an ocean of poorly made Chardonnay on the shelves out there, and that's what people are tuned in on. Because if you have a Chardonnay that's not good, what do? Well, you mallow the heck out of it and oak the heck out of it and put it in a bottle, and there you go.
Oh, and that's the other thing. So in addition to the kind of this, the pressing that we do, we've got a program of we've gone to much larger format barrels. So I use 600-liter punch-ons, which are 2.5 times the size of a Burgundy barrel, right? And we use Beaujolais from the Vosges forest. And the nice thing about that is, the surface area to volume thing. As you increase the volume, the surface area doesn't increase at the same rate, and so 2.5 times the volume in there, it's not 2.5 times the surface area. And so the first fill on one of these big 600-liter barrels is like the second or third fill on a little Burgundy barrel in terms of oak. And so the oak kind of, again, I want oak to just be an accent. I don't want it to be the first thing you perceive. And so these big punch-ons, the oak is much more kind of, back in the background. And so we have 2 different kinds of Chardonnay too. We've got an estate Chardonnay, which is kind of the similar to the 3 clones for the reds, but we also have a barrel select, which is our favorite barrel from the year. And so the barrel select is 100% barrel, and that's made in this, it's kind of over vintaged. It gets 18 months of barrel age, all on its own lees. We don't rack, we just let it sit on its lees and let the lees do their magic. But the estate wine, it's kind of a combination both of these large format punch-ons, and then also, and that's for half. And then the other half is these polypropylene tanks that I talked about, these flex tanks with no oak at all. So it's kind of half unoaked, half lightly oaked. And these punch-ons give you this kind of very neutral barrel kind of feel in terms of mouthfeel. I mean, it's kind of this rounded feel. And so I think the combination of all of that, of the thinking about, how much oak we want, how much kind of just pure Chardonnay characteristics, and the balance of trying to make a nice acidic wine. You talked about Chablis. So Neil Rosenthal in the 80s was the guy who made me fall in love with Chablis, because he kept coming into the restaurant with like Jean Davisat's, Le Prusse. And so I've been a huge, Chablis fan for, I don't know, 3 decades now. And so I try to make, try to make a Chablis style wine. I want something that's kind of racy, it's got, good acidity, and it's not super, we do get some wines that are fairly lush, but, pure Chardonnay characteristics, lightly oaked, and a nice acidity that makes you want to take another sip. That's the key.
One of the things that you touched on, I think that's interesting to have that style of Chardonnay that has that sort of, that racy acidity enough that it almost has a hint of minerality the way the acid is on it, but yet
exactly.
by you keeping it on the yeast for a long time, and then autolysis, those manoproteins gives it that rich mouth. So the combination of that round mouthfeel with that sort of linear acidity that you get, I think that's a neat combination.
Yeah.
Wow. Is it too early to open a bottle? Well, I gotta see.
It is for me.
Okay, so just wrapping a couple things up, is there any wine that, or a varietal or style of wine, let's say that, we'll open that up, that you've either tasted over the years or have been exposed to and you go, wow, at some point in my winemaking career, I'd really like to take a crack at
that? Oh, that's interesting. I
didn't mean to put you on the spot. I thought
no, I mean, there's certainly some benchmark wines, of course, that, oh my God. I guess, I mean, I do have a story about that. So when I defended my PhD, my thesis, when I had my talk, we went out to dinner that night, and I remember, and we went, and this is in Baltimore, Maryland, went to the little restaurant called Charleston, had a great wine list, and I still remember. So we had a bottle of Jackie Truchot, I think it was 1995 Moët Saint Denis, and it was so like savory and meaty, and it had all those wonderful characteristics. And I remember thinking, man, I mean, now I was going to be a scientist, right? This is before I came back, and I thought at that time, I thought, oh God, if I could make a wine like this, that would be, then I could stop, right? That would be the and I think I think again, like Don, got lucky. I think my 17 3 clones, though it is not Jackie Truchot's Moët Saint Denis, I'm not going to say that. I think that's as close as I've come so far. It has many of those kind of savory notes and lots of herbs and kind of an exotic nose that it's very hard to kind of put your finger on what some of the aromas are. They're this really ephemeral kind of things that aren't these kind of pure fruit notes. It's very kind of savory. So yeah, so that's I guess the thing.
Right answer.
Yeah. I mean,
that's hard to argue.
My benchmark, 1978 Latache is my benchmark wine, but I'm never going to make that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that much of the year, even in like you said, January is not as busy a month, but there's always things that you're thinking about. There's always what comes next. You're babysitting some wines that are in the cellar, those types of things. But when you're not doing the all-encompassing job called a winemaker, what do you do? What does David do for fun to get away from the winery and clear his head? Or what are some of your other likes or passions besides yeast and wine?
Oh, well, I mean, I live in the Pacific Northwest, so I mean, it's a playground, right? I mean, I've been mountain biking since, I guess bought my first mountain bike in 1984. So people would call it a gravel bike now, but so I get out multiple days a week, and we're in the Willamette Valley. 30 miles away is the sun has come out. Let me. Sorry, I had all the windows open because it was very dark in here. So we live in the Willamette Valley. The Tillamook State Forest is 25 miles away, and we are ringed by hills. So there's mountain biking everywhere. So I try to get out in summer, kind of between May and and Thanksgiving, get out 4 days a week. There's fantastic hiking up here. We have the Mount Hood National Forest, and the Salmon Huckleberry Wilderness is an hour and a half drive to the east of us, and as I said, the Tillamook State Forest is half an hour to the west of us. So my wife and I, in the summer, like to get out and hike the trails. I grew up in Southern California, quite near a ski resort, like 10 miles away from a ski lift. So that, I guess, has been my big love. Over time, I've been skiing for, I guess, over 50 years now. And as I said, after New York City, we wanted to regain our humanity, and I got to pick the next city. So we moved from New York City to Sun Valley, Idaho, and we just kind of hung out for a year and, became humans again and just skied. And so in picking the region that we were going to move to, that was one of the things. Had to have a ski resort within where you could do a day drive to skiing. So Mount Hood Meadows and Timberline are within 2.5-hour drive. So hopefully we have an embarrassment of riches this year. It's been closed because of too much snow. So hopefully in the next couple weeks, we will be able to get up there and start skiing. And then Bend, where Mount Bachelor is about a 4-hour drive from us. So that's kind of the weekend getaway. So we have these fantastic outdoor playgrounds to work with.
That's fantastic, because I know that I have a lot of trouble staying inside. My job keeps me inside all day long, and when I get home, I'd love to just get outside any way that I possibly can. So you guys are very lucky to have all that within close proximity. It's absolutely beautiful up there.
Well, that being said, this year it has been hard because it started raining like October 1st and it has not stopped yet. And so, we have this playground, but there's 5 months where unless you're really committed, like we went out this year, we went on a first day hike. So on January 1st, we went out for a guided hike at a state park because Oregon has this fantastic state park system. And so the state parks all have free day pass. You don't have to use your day pass on certain days like January 1st, and they have guided hikes. So we went on one of those, but it was 25 degrees. So it was interesting. It was nice in that it had been raining for 3 weeks before that. And so at least it was frozen. It wasn't muck, but it was cold. So
I only have one more question. The last thing I wanted to ask you was and you can say a Vidon Vineyard or Vidon wine, or you don't have to, but what are you drinking tonight or this weekend? Anything that you're opening. It doesn't have to be a wine.
Yeah, I think I put in my response probably a Martinez.
You did.
And a Martinez, for those who don't know, is gin, sweet vermouth, and Luxardo maraschino liqueur. So it's a cocktail. And I think I also like a nice Negroni or Boulevardier.
Very nice. Very nice. What gin you use?
It depends on, we have kind of fallen in love with Tanqueray's, oh God, what's it called? I'm not going to go to my cupboard. It's Rangpur gin. So it's gin that's made, with the regular botanicals plus also these Rangpur limes. So it's very citrusy. So we really like that. Yeah, I mean, I kind of, the restaurant that I worked at in New York, Aurora, the guy who was leaving, who then trained me to come in at the bottom rung, was Dale DeGroff, who effectively started this whole, classic cocktail movement that we've now. So I was trained by Dale DeGroff. And so Joe, like with Kevin Zarelli, Joe hired Dale at Aurora and basically gave him Jerry Thomas's book and said, go nuts, right? And so even back then, we had a juicer. So if you ordered something, we juiced for each of the. So I've kind of, for over decades now, I am also, in addition to wine, a cocktail fan. But if we're having a steak or something, I've got a bottle right now of sitting on the counter of John Groshow's 2015 Tempranillo that I'm looking forward to opening. So, the nice thing about being in the wine industry up here is that we all share with each other. So if I go to someone's winery, I bring a bottle, and if they come to mine, they bring a bottle. And so it's great that we get to experience each other's wine, because you do get house palate. I mean, I do, drink a lot of my wine, and you get in your own head with
That's great. That's good fringe benefits by visiting the neighbor and always taking a bottle of wine. I think that should be no matter if you're a winemaker or not. You show up at someone's house, you should definitely bring something, right?
Yeah.
Well, David, thank you again. Listen, I really appreciate it, and I will shoot you over an email sometime this weekend, and whenever I find out more about my plans and vacations, I'll reach out to you.
Yeah, come and see us, Dennis. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'd love to show the sausage being made.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. And I hope you have a nice weekend, and hope you get a chance to get on the slope soon.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, well, I hope you enjoyed listening to some of the great stories and the great explanations that I think Dr. Bellows does such a good job of explaining his winemaking decisions. If you want to read more about Compris Vineyard and see some of my personal tasting notes on their wines, go to the Bottle Talk, the website linked below. And there's also more to the story on Compris, formerly Vidon Vineyard. So we'll have a link for that as well, and also the ability to purchase some of these amazing wines. So remember to follow the Bottle Talk and Compris Vineyard on your favorite social media sites. Thanks for joining us.